Welcome back to the Lagoon of Mystery and another Moment of Tiki. Once again, I'm in the Lagoon of Mystery, which is my favorite home tiki bar. It is an outdoor tiki bar though, and even though we're in Texas where winter is normally an afterthought, there are several months, weeks, days during the year where it is not physically comfortable to be out here in the lagoon. It does get cold here on occasion. We do get freezes. We do every few years get some snow. We get sleet and ice and everything. So it's not really conducive to tikiing outdoors. In the house, we have a loft area that has long served as a video media room for our kids with video games, sofas, that sort of thing. As our kids have gotten older though, we realized that they were not utilizing it as much. They had their own interests, they were staying more to their rooms, moving off to college, that sort of thing. So my wife hit upon the idea, if we had to remodel it, why not remodel it as tiki? There was some nasty carpet in there I had to rip up, and I replaced it with nice laminate flooring. And we also repainted the walls. So this is the early stages of converting a room into a tiki room. Now once I got the flooring in and once I got the walls painted, the first step, at least in my mind, is to install baseboards along the bottom. Suitably tiki baseboards, which are not sold in stores, therefore I had to manufacture myself. So come on with me upstairs into the loft and watch the beginning of a long, drawn-out project. That's probably going to take several years, but you'll be in on the ground floor. Come on.
As Bamboo Ben would say, no white walls. We're painting the walls and ceiling an intermediate tan color so that once we start putting up wall coverings, no bright, eye-catching spots of white will show through.
Now, I'm going to make some baseboards to go along the floor here in the loft. Because of reasons that are boring and meaningless to most people, I've decided to leave the existing baseboards in place and put the new baseboards that I'm creating over the top of them. This necessitates me cutting a cove space in the new boards so the old ones will fit in there, so it'll go flush against the wall. To do so, I need to measure to see how big the cove space I have to cut out is. So this ruler and this ruler. So it is approximately 3 inches tall by 3/8 inches deep. All right, let's go cut some boards. And here we are set up in my driveway. This is my table saw. I inherited it from my grandfather. It doesn't have any of the modern safety features, so you got to be alert and very, very careful. I have the rip fence set up right here for the 3/8 inch deep cut. Got the saw blade set for 3 inches high. I did a test run with a test piece of molding I did about 3 years ago. This is one of the first baseboards I ever did, and I followed this pattern since. It works. The cove that it cuts in the back fits over the existing baseboards. However, I would suggest if you don't have to do it this way, don't, because I just like making my life more difficult. Cutting a vertical cut in a vertical narrow board is not easy. It tries to fight you. But, you know, I'm one to only learn from mistakes. We've got the boards I'm using are pine 1x6, 8 foot long. This is the wood that I've used for all my baseboards and all my crown molding. It's fairly soft, easy to carve, easy to power carve, takes to the router fairly well. Best of all, it's really cheap. It stains and takes urethane really nicely, so it has a nice look to it, especially after I do the torch treatment. And when I'm cutting this, one thing to be aware of is that there's the possibility of kickback. Kickback is when the saw blade, which rotates towards me during the cut, gets crosswise with the wood, grabs it, and throws it back with significant force. So you don't want to be behind the board during the cut, and you don't want anyone else or anything else behind the cut, just in case that happens. Safety first. I have a folding roller set up to catch the outfeed, so we don't lose balance over there. I've got my safety goggles in case any debris is kicked up. So exercising an abundance of caution. Let's start cutting some wood. Well, I finished cutting all 4 boards lengthwise without any mishaps. I had to go slow and steady and cautiously. It took about 5 minutes per board, maybe a little more, it just inched along. But we are done with that. And now all I have to do is cut out the cove piece and we're done for the night. I've got my saw blade set at 3/8 of an inch. I've got my rip fence set up to guide, and when I turn it on, I'm just going to slice it and this section is going to come off nice and easily. At least that's the theory. Well, here it is the next day, and I have my 4 boards laid out and ready to start routing. I have the piece that I cut out from them yesterday. I'm just keeping it in position so it gives a little support so this doesn't lean over so much. That's not that big of a deal. The first thing I'm going to do with the board is cut a Cove Channel down the middle. If you look and see the previous boards, the baseboards that I've done, I had the motif where I have cove bit and I routed out a straight channel along either end. With this one, I'm only going to do it along the top. So make sure that it's on the proper side. The reason is that because the floating floor of laminate that I installed upstairs up to and against the existing baseboards, there's an 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch gap around there because floating floors, laminate or hardwood, will expand and contract over the course of the year as temperature and humidity changes. So if you don't leave expansion gaps in the floating floor, then if it runs up against something hard and unyielding like a baseboard, then that can cause buckling in the floor throughout, and you want to avoid that. That's one of the reasons why sometimes doors stick in the door jamb in the winter or in the summer as temperature and humidity changes. What that means in practical terms is that when I install the baseboard, I'm going to have to come along the bottom with shoe molding. I'm going to stain and varnish some shoe molding and then put along the bottom to cover up what little bits of that expansion gap show underneath the baseboard that I'm putting in. So one thing that I learned early on when you're routing into wood, you don't need to go very deep. I'm looking at the Cove bit. A Cove bit is kind of a domed circular bit with two blades that spin around and cut out a half circle space in there in the wood. Shallower cuts are much more visible than you would expect. So you just go a shallow cut and then look at it, and it's going to be more impressive and more visible than you would initially expect. If it's not, then you can always adjust the depth on this and go back and take another cut and make it a little deeper. But for the most part, you don't need to go that deep when you're routering patterns into your trim work. And cutting deep patterns puts more strain on the blade and the motor on your router, so that's best avoided. So multiple light passes is always more effective than trying to get one really deep cut in a single pass. At this point, we want to draw on here the triangular pattern to serve as a guide for the router when I cut the pieces out. So to get from blank wood to here, I use this template. I designed this almost 3 years ago now. It was the very first woodworking, wood cutting router template that I designed. I printed out a triangular pattern, alternating directions on paper, the proper size, then taped that over this cardstock and used an X-Acto knife to slice each line in there. From this point, I lay it on the wood because it's a 6-inch width, and then I use a pencil to trace all the way down the length and take it away, and you can see once all of the patterns have been drawn onto the board, now the tedium starts. Each one of these lines has to be routed out individually. Unless you have a CNC machine where you can just run each board through and it automatically does everything perfectly every time for you and you don't have to stress out about it. It's just going to take patience and determination. When I use the trim router on this, I use a jig because all of these are at 45-degree angles. I've learned from experience that I am not steady enough to do it freehand, because with the torque of the machine and the willingness of the bit to grab into the grain and start wandering all over the place, it looks like drunk Uncle Henry, tried to ride a donkey backwards and route the patterns in place. So I created this jig. A jig is, I was going to say fancy word, but it's not a fancy word at all. A jig essentially means anything that helps you make a cut. It can be complicated with clamps, it can be all sorts of things, but in this case, it's a piece of scrap board that I cut at 45-degree angle. I hold it in place to help guide my trim router for straight cuts and prevent it from wandering all over the place. Now, I have heard people say that they wouldn't want to use a straight edge jig or anything else because they don't want their trim to look too perfect. Trust me when I say that's not going to be an issue. Even with a jig to help guide the trim router, you're still going to have mistakes. It's still going to be times where it catches the grain and kind of walks off to the side. You're going to overshoot the mark and have one of these lines that's longer than the others. There are an infinite number of ways this can go wrong. And you know what? That's fine. Again, this isn't a CNC machine. This is supposed to be a primitive looking pattern ground into the wood, and we're going to do some additional things to the wood later on to make it look even more aged and abused and battered. So, little deviations aren't going to matter at all. In fact, consider they add to the character. And there you have it, the first triangle with the first divot screw up mistake. You can see, I don't know if you can see right there, but there is a knot hole, and that knot is harder than the surrounding wood, and so when the router blade hit that, it grabbed on and tried to go around, and that's why we had that little jump right there. So, first triangle, first mistake, first of many.
Burning the wood trim is probably the most fun step of the entire process, and one of the most essential. The flames can flare up impressively, so make sure there is nothing flammable nearby. The wood can get quite hot, so have a plan for how you are going to hold it or prop it up. I use a simple Burns-O-Matic hand torch to scorch the surface of the wood. This has the added advantage of disguising any tear-outs or burrs left behind during the routing process. Any pencil markings left on the wood following the routing process are burned away as well. The softer wood carbonizes as it burns and turns to soot, leaving harder grain behind. The color change is dramatic and an essential step in the sleight of hand that converts cheap pine boards into more exotic and mysterious carvings. When you apply the fire to the wood, it's important that you don't let the flame linger in any one spot too long. If you hold the torch in one place for too long, the board could actually catch fire, which would be quite dangerous. Apply the flame with a constant motion, as if you're painting with fire. You want a nice, even char when you're finished. Once the wood has a nice, even char, it's time for the least fun step in the process, wire brushing. Take a brass or steel wire brush and scrub the surface of the torched wood. The carbonized char will come away, leaving a dramatically textured surface behind. If you have a lot of wood to brush, your arms and shoulders can get tired very quickly. I've tried using a wire brush attachment on my power drill to speed the process, but that proved to be far too aggressive.
After the routing is done, the flame treatment is done, and the wire brushing is done to reveal the dramatic grain texture on here, we're ready to apply the stain. There's one more optional step that I like to do prior to that. You can or you can't, depending on your personal taste. I've tried it both ways, and I prefer generally the woodwork with this, and that's to simulate damage of age, use, and abuse. What I have is a simple angle grinder with a grinding wheel. You can see here how we've added a lot of damage and destruction that'll show up quite nicely once everything's finished and allay anyone's concerns about the woodwork being too perfect.
Next, it's time to apply stain to the wood. I like to start with a coat of Minwax Special Walnut Stain, with a top coat of Minwax Dark Walnut the following day for a deeper, richer color. After the stain's dried for a couple of days, I apply a minimum of 2 coats of polyurethane on the front, back, and sides. I prefer a satin finish. Now the baseboards are finally ready to be installed. All that hard work wire brushing and burning is about to pay off. You can see how the cove section I cut from the back created a hollow that allows the new molding to fit over the existing baseboards. I can't say how happy I am that this worked out. Where the new baseboards meet in the corner, I miter cut the ends at a 45-degree angle so that they would join neatly. Attaching the new baseboards to the wall takes a little planning. I use an electronic stud finder to locate the wall studs behind the sheetrock, then mark the spot with a small piece of blue painter's tape. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm a fanatic about pilot holes. So I use my power drill to make a pilot hole that goes through the new baseboards and drywall into the hidden stud. I use black 1 5/8 inch paneling nails to nail the baseboard into place. I use black because it easily blends in with dark wood and doesn't require putty or stain to disguise. The finishing touch is a quick couple of taps with a nail set to force the nail down flush with the surface of the wood. Then I repeat the process on the top half of the baseboard. When you're dealing with a 6-inch wide piece of wood that has a good section of its thickness cut away, cupping is a possibility that could push either the top or the bottom away from the wall if not secured. It's important to make sure you're nailing your baseboard onto a wall stud. The sheetrock or drywall may seem solid enough, but it doesn't have holding power. Your baseboards could easily pull away from the wall if the nails are only holding onto sheetrock. There are certainly sheetrock anchor kits available, but these are best used for hanging frames or other items on the wall and would be inappropriate to use here. I had to use 2 boards to span the entire length of the wall. Where these 2 boards met, I joined them using a miter cut so that one board overlaps the other and holds it in place. This allows for greater horizontal stability. I hadn't yet learned this miter join trick when I installed the baseboards in the Lagoon of Mystery, and I used a simple straight cut. You can see how horizontal movement could be an issue. Because the laminate flooring I installed is a floating floor, which means it is not anchored to anything, there is roughly a 1/2-inch gap that runs the perimeter of the room to allow for the floor's expansion and contraction with variations in heat and humidity throughout the year. The baseboards mostly cover this gap, but not entirely. To make up that difference and cover those remaining gaps, I installed shoe molding. I prepared this shoe molding the exact same way I did with the baseboards and installed it the same way as well, although I didn't worry about locating wall studs, as the shoe molding would be nailed directly into the baseboards. Finally, all that hard work is paid off with custom baseboards installed that match the new floor and are ready for bamboo and lahala matting wall coverings to be installed over that tan wall. But that's for another episode.
And there you have it, the very first baby steps that go into converting a normal, mundane, run-of-the-mill room into a tiki room. Now, as you could see, we still got a long way to go. The walls are painted, the floor's done, and we got some baseboards in that are kind of sort of hinting at tiki, but the vast majority of work still lies ahead of us. And that's fine. This is not going to be something I'm going to finish in a weekend. This is probably not something that's going to be finished in the next year. It's going to be a multi-year project. But that's fine because I plan to be doing these Moment of Tiki videos for a while to come. So you will be able to come along with me on every step of the journey, and hopefully some of you will even be able to surpass me and get your own tiki rooms finished long before I do. So in the spirit of that can-do attitude, aloha until next time.